Welcome to the Mad in America podcast, your source for science, psychiatry, and social justice.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Mad in America podcast. My name is Brooke Siem, and I am the author of the award-winning memoir on antidepressant withdrawal, May Cause Side Effects. Today's interview is a little different because I am here in my kitchen table with my mother, who's rolling her eyes at me as I introduce her. And the reason why we wanted to bring her on the show is because so often the world of psychiatric drug withdrawal or over medication, we can hear about parents who are grieving children, or we hear about children who are struggling and their parents don't understand what's going on, but we kind of don't spend a lot of time talking about what happens when a parent decides to medicate a child. Especially in my case, I was 15, so I had some agency, and we thought it might be an interesting discussion. So, hi, Mom. Welcome to the show.
Hi, sweetie.
We were actually talking earlier about your perspective, and I spent a lot of time talking about my story and how it all felt to me. But let's talk about how it felt to you. So for the audience, what happened is that my father passed away when I was 15, and within a year, I was on 2 antidepressants and another 4 drugs to kind of counter the side effects of the antidepressants, although that wasn't really clear until later. And from my perspective, it didn't really feel like this was a big deal. We just went to a doctor. It was 2001. We started off at a child psychologist. I didn't get along with her. Went to a child psychiatrist. And I walked out with some scripts, and it just felt kind of like this is what you do. And then that changed the course of my life for sure. So how did it look for you?
Well, from my perspective, I suddenly lost my husband, and Brooke suddenly lost her father in July of 2001. And Brooke is an only child, and I was left a single parent with a kid who was clearly grieving because it was a very sudden and unexpected event. And when a parent is suddenly thrust into a situation where you're a single parent and you have one family member left and you're grieving yourself, it felt like an immense responsibility, an immense load. And the person that I used to discuss Brooke with was gone. So when she started to struggle, and obviously it's expected that she should struggle with the loss of her dad, she was close to her dad. When she started to struggle, of course, my fear became probably exaggerated. And I started to see some things that really terrified me, things that looked like an eating disorder to me. And there were just also some behaviors that seemed unusual and that made me very, very anxious. And at the same time, it didn't seem like she was grieving in a way that I would have expected. So I went to a couple of friends of mine who had degrees in psychology and asked for advice, and they both suggested that I take her to a child psychologist. And if any of you have read her book, you know how that went. She went to the child psychologist. She did not get along with the child psychologist. She refused to cooperate, but I didn't know that. So this is the first situation that sometimes parents, especially parents of teens, can get into where the child psychologist doesn't always want to share what's going on with your child with you. And there are good reasons for that, because if the child knew that whatever was being discussed in that session was going to get back to the parents, it's very possible the child wouldn't be honest with the psychologist. But in my case, the child psychologist, after about 6 months, called me and said that I was wasting my money, that she couldn't tell me what was going on in the session, but that she was diagnosing Brooke with an anxiety and depressive disorder and that I should take her to a psychiatrist. And at this point, without having any other input, that was the decision I made. Looking back and knowing what I know now, it isn't the advice that I would give to any parent that is experiencing something similar to what I went through.
I think we're seeing some of this was in schools. I mean, there was law that was just passed in California saying that schools can't inform the parents what's going on with a kid's sexual orientation if they're having issues with it. I know there's a lot of talk in the Bad Therapy book by Abigail Schreier about schools and counselors keeping mental health information from parents. It was a little different for me because I was 15 and very willful. But did it occur to you that you should have known what was going on?
At that time, I just accepted it as a given that because of HIPAA laws and because this professional with a PhD in psychology said to me, I cannot tell you what's going on, but I didn't think about challenging that. And I don't know what would have happened if I had. My feeling at the time was that if I had challenged that, she still wouldn't have told me. And when you're dealing with a teenager, you're at a point with a parent where it's a very delicate balancing act between taking care of that child and letting that child have some autonomy. Lots of times parents don't have a lot of choice there. You certainly weren't going to talk to me at that time.
So what happened after the psychologist said that? Because as we've also talked about, I have so much memory loss from this period of time. So for me, there's just kind of this fuzzy memory of being in the psychologist's office for the last time. And then sometime later, a fuzzy memory of being in front of some psychiatrist. I vaguely remember where his office is or was. Don't remember his name. Don't know how long it took in between each appointment. Don't remember if I had an opinion really on the whole situation.
You weren't offering any objections or any opinions. You were pretty much doing, I said, this psychologist says you need to go to a psychiatrist, so I made an appointment, and you just acquiesced. Had you balked a little bit, I probably would have backed off if you had really, really objected, but you were very acquiescent. And I don't think either of us really understood what we were getting into. No one told us what might happen or how long you might be on these.
Were you in the room with me for the first meeting?
Not that I recall. And then when you started to take the meds and you had bad reactions to the first 2 or 3 meds, they just switched you to something else until we got something that it seemed that you could tolerate. And it seemed okay. You didn't complain about it. You didn't say it made you feel any sort of way, or you were still very functional at school. And I don't recall that you started eating more. I think actually just knowing that you were on the drug, as terrible as this sounds right now, knowing that you were on the drug made me feel somehow supported, like someone else was taking care of you too. And so it was almost more for me than for you. And that is what I think is really the problem here. I think with kids that are placed on anxiety meds or ADHD meds or a lot of these different meds, especially when they're very young, it's for the convenience of the parents, the school, the teacher, more so than for the kids. And I think looking back, knowing you were on it somehow made me feel supported and safer, because I thought that you were going down a bad trajectory, and this seemed to interrupt that. And I felt like I had done something.
But did it actually interrupt it? Or was it just the placebo effect?
I think it was a placebo in my mind, actually. Right? I'm looking back, I'm not so sure it was really for you. I think it was for me. And then what happens down the road is that what we do for ourselves as parents, unfortunately, land on the kid, and the kid has to go through oftentimes horrendous withdrawal, and suffers all kinds of stuff that never should have been suffered. When the biggest reason, bottom line, looking back, that Brooke was medicated was because I was afraid. That was it. It was because I was afraid, not because Brooke needed to be medicated. And if there's a message I'd like to get out to parents, that's it. We need to look at what this medication is doing for us psychologically, and whether that's really what's needed.
Do you recall any level of informed consent?
I certainly don't recall the psychiatrist saying, this is the risk, these are the side effects, this is how hard it is to take and to get off it, this is what we expect, this is what you could expect to see. It was no, we'll just numb this anxiety.
And there was no plan.
There was no plan. And it was this psychologist who diagnosed you with anxiety and depression. Mm-hmm. And you weren't talking to me. Mm-hmm. So from all, I just believed her.
Yeah.
My child has anxiety and depression. And then the psychiatrist gave you pills for that. Mm-hmm. And I am completely on the outside. I don't know what you've been talking about to the psychologist or not talking about. I just have to believe what she said. And then here's this other professional, the psychiatrist, who seems to concur and gives you medication. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll pay for it. And then by the time you went off to college, it was completely out of my control. At that point, you were seeing the psychiatrist yourself. You were deciding for yourself whether you wanted, to continue on the meds or not. I was only in peripheral control for a couple of years. Then you went to college.
Sometime around my 16th birthday, I think, is when the medication happened. And then even as soon as I was given the antidepressants, then there was the parade of doctors. There was the endocrinologist and gastroenterologist, and that went on for years. So it kind of became normal for us to be deferring to medical professionals.
Well, and we had no clue that all of these symptoms you were having, whether it was the gastroenterologist, the thyroid, the whatever, we had no clue that it was a side effect of these meds. All of a sudden, just all of these medical problems arose, and we were dealing with them one at a time as if they were a valid problem, and trying to find an additional med that would calm down whatever symptom it was. And no one, not the gastroenterologist or the endocrinologist or anyone else, ever said, she's on Effexor and Wellbutrin. I wonder if...
So there's gastro effects right on the side effect label. I wonder if that's it.
No one ever said that. And we never connected the dots.
They tried to take out my gallbladder.
Yeah, they tried to do that. They tried to do another really big gastro surgery that luckily we did not do.
I had an endoscopy and a colonoscopy at 19.
You had thyroid problems. You couldn't eat anything. You were in constant pain. You're having hot flashes. Your hair was falling out.
And it's just that those symptoms were delayed enough where it didn't make it obvious that it was the Effexor or the Wellbutrin. When did you start to have a hunch that maybe the antidepressants were part of the problem? Because I was medicated from 15 until 30. And I remember when you started talking about it, it was probably in my, I want to say maybe 27, 28. But I imagine concerns had been percolating for a while.
You weren't getting better. If what I would say is you were getting worse in terms of the depression, I would say, and anxiety to a certain extent, but mainly the depression.
Yeah.
You were very lethargic. You were very withdrawn. You were very immovable and had very little enthusiasm. And it just seemed like every time I saw you, it was getting worse. And I would talk to you almost every day on the phone when you were walking your dog at night. Our deal was, you can live in New York, but you're my only child, so you have to call me once a day. So every night when she was walking her dog, she would call me and I would hear the flatness in her voice and the lack of life. And then she would come home, and one day she crawled into bed with me and just started talking about how she thought there was something permanently wrong with her. And I knew that. I knew that she wasn't. I know this child. I carried this child. I knew there wasn't something permanently wrong with her. And the only difference I could attribute anything to was these drugs. But when I brought it up to you, you told me I was wrong and shut me down.
I remember getting very mad about that. Just felt like anybody who's been in that level of depression knows how frustrating and patronizing it can feel, and someone dares suggest that maybe the problem is you.
But I wasn't saying the problem was you. I was saying the problem was the drugs.
Well, you were saying the problem was the drugs, but I was so protective of them because it felt like in my body, the way I felt, my thought process is if I feel this way on antidepressants, it's just going to be so much worse without them. And I really just, when I say the problem was you, is you would say to me, you can choose not to be depressed. And I never understood what that meant. It felt like you were asking me to choose the weather every day. And that's what was just so frustrating because it felt so outside of me. But at the same time, I wasn't making any changes in my life because I think that that's what the antidepressants did to me. They gave me such a convenient excuse that nothing was my fault and that it was just my depression. My life sucked because I was depressed, not because my life sucked.
Well, you had no initiative in any way.
Yeah, and there was no
even though when I tried to encourage you by supporting all of your various endeavors, whether they were educational or career oriented or whatever, I always tried to support you, but the initiative was largely lacking.
So I really don't know if I would have ever gotten off the drugs if I hadn't have had these sort of cosmic interventions. And so I turned 30 and I got this opportunity to travel around the world for a year. And logistically carrying that amount of drugs in my suitcase just wasn't going to work. And then I was also starting to it was finally starting to sink in that I shouldn't be this depressed if I'm on this many antidepressants and have been. But I just thought I needed to change the type of drug I was on. And I figured there had been some massive scientific leap forward in 15 years, which there hadn't been. But do you remember when I told you I wanted to get off the antidepressants? Do you remember that conversation?
I know it was over the phone. You were walking the dog. I remember that I was 100% in support of that. And I do remember when you started into withdrawal, when you started to come off the Effexor and you started into withdrawal, and I could hear the difference in your voice. And I just wanted you to stick because I could hear the life coming back.
Okay, let's kind of focus in on this time period because I was 30 years old. I went and saw a new psychiatrist because I had been with my horrible GP and I was trying to do the right thing and go see the shrink. And she said that if I wanted to get off the Effexor, I was on 37.5 milligrams, which was the lowest dose on the market. She just said I had to stop. And I had no knowledge of withdrawal, had no clue that it could be as bad as it was. I thought I would have the flu for a couple days. So I just kind of blindly stopped taking it. So in the first couple conversations we had, I mean, what do you recall from those conversations? Because I don't remember them.
Well, to a large extent, I was still in the mode that I'd been in ever since you were 15 or 16, where, I only knew what I'd been told. Every bit of information I got was either through a psychiatrist, a psychologist, or you. And I had also learned that you were going to run your own life in your own way. So when you told me that you were going to come off, then my only choice was to support that. So initially, I might have had a few misgivings about it, just a little worry, but I knew that if you had decided to do this, then I was going to support you. But then when we got a few days in and the withdrawal symptoms started to hit, and you called up a little bit in a panic because you were worried about the thoughts, the intrusive thoughts that were going through your head and the horrific visions you were having.
What did I tell you? Because I don't think I told you the extent of what was going on.
No, but I could feel, by listening to you, I could feel the terror in you and the repulsion in you and how you were struggling. I could feel it. You didn't tell me every little detail, but you did tell me that you were having violent visions. Things like that. But at the same time, I could hear and feel the life starting to, it was like the blood had started to run through you again. I could feel the life. And at that point, I knew how afraid you were. And that's why I suggested that you call Kathy. But I really wanted you to stick at that point because I could feel the life coming back. You were starting to sound more like the kid I remembered, even though you were in early withdrawal. And I'd wanted you to come off them for so many years. At that point, I just wanted to hold space for you and help you get through. And of course, I didn't know how long this horrible period was going to last either.
I always say that the thing that got me through the most is just that when I called, you picked up the phone. And we'd established that connection and that communication for years, which helped. But I really needed an anchor point, and you were it.
Now I, have a practice where I'm working with people who are coming off of psychiatric drugs. Most people that I work with do need that anchor point, and what they don't need is their mother or whoever that anchor point is saying, well, you could always reinstate. Well, you could go back on the drugs. That is not what these people need. These people need to hear, this is temporary. You're going to make it. You're going to make it through it. Let's get through the next hour. Let's get through the next day. That window could be happening anytime. You're going to make it. I'm proud of you. That's what they need to hear. Because again, I really think that when one of my clients complains to their mother about how much they're suffering with withdrawal, and the mother says, well, you could go back on the meds. Maybe you just need them, or you used to do so well on, you always did so well on them. This is a convenience for the mother, not the best thing for the person who has made a decision for a rational reason to get off these drugs.
I feel like people can be put on these drugs in such a flippant, irrational, thoughtless way, but nobody comes off them that way. It's always intentional with a reason or a lot of rational thought, especially now that there's so much information about withdrawal and it's becoming more common knowledge to know that they can be really difficult to get off of. When people are commenting on my Instagram or TikTok videos, there's all the people talking about the horrible side effects they've had. There's always also a lot of people who say, I'm so scared to come off of them because of all these things I hear. And it's a little bit of a double-edged sword in doing advocacy around this, because I think that part of the reason why I, in some ways, did as well as I did in withdrawal, even though it was so horrible I got a book deal out of it, it was because I was completely naive.
I think that there was an advantage that I had also in that you were going through so much of it when you were not living with me.
Yeah. I was about to ask, because then I came home in August and we saw it.
We saw it, and I had also seen it a little bit, maybe a year or so prior to when you decided to tape or to come off, because there was one time you came home and for whatever reason, there was a problem with your prescription. You didn't have enough, and you were an absolute mess.
Yeah, that was the effects where the withdrawal or the agitation would hit me really fast. I just thought that was kind of all it was going to be. And I figured, I had experienced that already. This is going to be uncomfortable, but fine. And then it was so much more.
Mm-hmm. So I had seen that before. Mm-hmm. And then when you came home, though, the decision had been made. You came home because you were going to leave for remote year. It was not a choice to reinstate. Mm-hmm. And by that time, you were also you were also working with Alan. And that was a real support for me that you had someone to work with.
Alan was a counselor doing it was kind of like an East meets West type of counseling called Compassion Key. That really helped me because withdrawal felt it felt so different than any other emotions I'd felt before. And it would kind of manifest in different ways. And I felt like I needed a way of dealing with all this and managing it that had a little bit more soul than just your typical clinical CBT or whatnot. Was there ever a point in the process where you were worried that I wasn't going to make it out or that something really kind of had gone wrong? I mean, because it just lasted so long.
It lasted so long, but deep in my soul, I knew you were going to be okay. I never worried that you weren't going to make it out. At the same time, it's hard for a mother to watch your child suffer. You don't want your child to suffer. And I think that is another reason why so many mothers of my clients come back with, well, you could always, go back on the drugs, because it's so hard to hold your child while they cry. It's so hard to watch your child, writhe in pain. I truly understand that. But once they get through it, they have their life back. And I think that if we can hold steady for our kids as they come through it, it's so worth it.
Took about a year for me to get through the really severe stuff. And then another year with occasional windows and waves. But there was really a period of figuring out how to be an adult. Finally, after all of that, even though I was 32.
And that's probably one of my major objections to medicating people, especially when they're young, very young, when they're 7 or when they're 8 or when they're 10. You put them on these meds, they don't learn coping skills, they don't learn any kind of resilience, and then you expect them at 25 to come off the meds and understand how to do life, and they've never had a chance to do that. Mm-hmm. It's so incredibly unfair to medicate a child or a young adult and not allow them those precious years of learning how to get up again after they fall, and to give them the sense that something's wrong with them and that they can't live without medication. You need this med because you're somehow deficient.
And even if you don't say that with words, you say it with action.
Absolutely. That is the message. And every client I've ever had has faced that. Mm-hmm. And to learn who they are, to figure out who they are after years and years of being medicated is an amazing adventure, but it's really scary for them because they're not sure who's in there. And so it's a completely terrifying place to be. And my clients are angry because they were put on meds at a young age and now they've lost all of their 20s, maybe half of their 30s. It's delayed them in every possible way, forming relationships, creating a career, getting an education. It's delayed them in every way. And if you're 50 when you're ready to come off, then it almost feels like it's too late. It's just such a big decision to medicate a child. And I really think that parents need a lot more information than they're given. And they need to be able to look down the road years and years.
Because parents aren't being given information, what questions can parents be asking to get the information they need?
Well, the first thing that I would really be looking at, especially if the child is young, if you have a child that's exhibiting some sort of unwanted behavior, like the child doesn't want to be in school, as an example, the child throws giant tantrums when mommy leaves, whenever mommy leaves, the child is, they're overly attached to mom. Or there are certain situations where a child of this age should be able to function, but this child is not functioning. And so the teacher is saying, let's put the kid on a med, or the pediatrician is saying, let's put the kid on a med. I think that the parent needs to try to find out and figure out why that kid is acting like this. It's, for the most part, I think that it is not what's wrong with the child. It's what happened to the child, or what is happening to the child. It's a very painful thing to have to do, but sometimes you need to look at your own parenting skills, your own situation in your home. What might be going on in the home that's affecting the child. Look at all of those things and then put yourself in therapy. If you need to put yourself in therapy, talk about how this is affecting you and why this child's behavior is getting under your skin to this extent. So much of the time, it's about the parent and not about the child. And that was very true of me. If I had put myself in therapy about, you're grieving and now you're this single parent and you've got this kid that isn't eating. And, if I had realized so much of this was about me needing help and someone to hold on to instead of making Brooke the patient, I think we could have avoided a lot of things.
Are there any specific questions that, like, if a parent ends up in a pediatrician's office now, and the pediatrician is suggesting medication, maybe the parent is even considering medication, maybe they feel like they've tried all that, what specific questions would you have them ask a doctor before they make this call?
Well, I would obviously want to know everything I could about the particular drug that was being proposed, what kind of tests had been done on that drug, what the research says about this drug, what the long-term effects of this drug are, how often or how long is it proposed that this child would be on the drug, what are the side effects of the drug. If a child has been on the drug for 10 years, what effects are we seeing in kids who've been on that drug for 10 years? I would ask all of those things. But before I ever got to that point, I would really be looking at the circumstances around this child. And I'll give you one example that I came across very recently. There was a child whose pediatrician and whose school personnel told the mother that this little girl, 8 years old, should be put on ADHD meds. And the mother resisted. The mother actually was a foster mother. This particular little girl had been abandoned twice by her biological mother and ended up in foster care twice. by the time she was 8 years old. So at 8 years old, the school nurse, the pediatrician, the principal of the school, the teacher, everybody is telling this mother this kid is behind in school, is a problem in school, and needs to be medicated. The mother resisted, and several months later, when the adoption of that child came through, and I actually went to court with the mother, and the child was formally adopted
By the foster
mother. All of a sudden, all the problems that had been happening in school magically disappeared. That child was never medicated, and this child is perfect in school now. So I think that what we really need to look at is what is causing these difficulties with learning, these behavior problems, what's causing this with the child. And medication should be an absolutely last resort. And if it's used, it should be extremely short term.
And some good Googling should probably be done in addition to talking to a doctor, because the doctor's going to say these things are safe, they're therapeutic doses, they're not going to know anything about the latest research, they're not going to know anything about taking people off, they're not going to have any of knowledge about what, like a pediatrician is not going to know what happens to some kid 10 years down the line. You have to become the child's advocate. You and I also have, the older I get, this seems to be the rare benefit of having a really strong relationship that's weathered all of this. And I wonder what advice you would have for a parent whose kid won't listen to them, who has a difficult relationship with their child.
I think that if you had that unfortunate situation, it might be important to find an adult that your child will relate to, that your child can confide in, whether that is a relative or a friend or even a very trusted therapist. That kid probably needs someone to talk to. And I would say also to the parent, hold on, because the way your child relates to you at 15 or even 20 can be so different from the way they relate to you at 25. I promise you, if you hold on, one day when they're 25 or 26, you'll pick up the phone and your child will say, I called to apologize because you were right all along. It'll happen, parents. It will happen. You just got to hold on. But in the meantime, they need somebody to talk to. Yeah, someone that you trust, but that they trust also.
So 8 years later, it's been 8 years since I think I stopped taking my last Wellbutrin in around July 2016. Both of our lives have changed because of this very casual decision we made when I was 15. Knowing what we know now, I guess, what would you have done differently? Where would the first intervention have been?
Knowing what I know now, which, is an impossible situation, I might have gotten a second opinion when that psychologist said, I'm diagnosing her with an anxiety and depressive disorder. I would have gotten a second opinion right there. And I might have, I don't know if you would have told me at that time, but I might have said, what do you think of that psychologist? And maybe you would have told me what you really thought. But I think parents get a second opinion and a third opinion. And if it doesn't feel right, or it doesn't resonate with you, it doesn't hit you right in the gut, keep looking for help. And if your psychiatrist is giving you trouble about coming off, in my opinion, that's not the right psychiatrist.
Mm-hmm. So you have been working with people in withdrawal and who are tapering. What are a couple of the takeaways that, after 8 years of this, you've learned now that you've graduated multiple people through their taper?
It's just so important, I think, to maintain an encouraging and positive outlook. It's so easy for people to get discouraged. And at the same time, if you're going through a taper, there's a certain amount of acceptance that you have to finally come to. It's not going to be a cakewalk. You have to be willing to be uncomfortable to get what you want. You have to be a little stubborn and have a long-term perspective. Ultimately, you're going to make it. If you hold out long enough, you're going to make it. Everybody makes it if you hold out long enough.
Let's talk about that a little bit, just because it's up in my life right now where I'm supporting someone who's tapering. And when they're in a deep wave, and even though I've been there and they know I've been there, there's just nothing that seems like it's able to pull them out of that. And I know, because I've been through it, and people who've also been through it, we all say the same thing, that there's just this level of radical acceptance that has to happen. But I don't know how to teach that. I don't know if it's something you can teach, or if it's just something you learn after getting so tired from fighting. You deal with clients who are in that level of the deep waves all the time. And I think any advice for people who are in deep waves right now would be possibly very useful.
I've noticed that for many of my clients, the emotional torture that they're going through is far worse than the physical torture. Now, this isn't always true, but I would say that 75% of the time, my clients will report that the intrusive thoughts, the fear, the panic, the emotional stuff is much worse than all of the physical symptoms, that they're able to cope with the headaches or the shaking or the fatigue or the gastro stuff or whatever, much more than the emotional stuff. Along with that, I think one of the worst parts of it for most of my clients is the fear that it will never end and that they will never be better. And, many of them have reported to me that they feel like the only way out is death because it's so intense and so terrible. And they need me to say, you're getting better. They need me to be able to point out, 6 months ago, you told me this, this, and this. 6 months ago, you couldn't do that, that, and that. Now look at you. Also, another thing that really helps with my clients is I have them keep a calendar where they write down every day, whether it's a red day, that would be like a deep wave, a yellow day, which is like it's not a great day, but it's a tolerable day, or a green day, that would be a window. And I make them track it. And when they're really deep in a bad wave, we go back and we say, look, 40% of the time, you're in a green day, and another 20% of the time you have yellow. So 60% of the time you're doing okay. You just got to get through it. So there's that. There's the encouragement to keep going and to keep dropping because you feel like you're making progress that way. But then if it's immediately a really bad day, and if they're having trouble physically as well as emotionally, I find often that a guided meditation session, a hypnosis session, things like that can give them an hour of relief. Mm-hmm. I have clients, I provide tapes for my clients, and at night they play them during the night. If they're having trouble sleeping, it just relaxes them enough to get through it. We've just got to get through it a day at a time.
Well, thank you so much for talking with Mad in America. And I've always been so excited to introduce you to the world, whether or not you wanted it. And I get people who, when they email me about the book and they talk to me about it, they just say, my God, your mother, she's just such an angel and such a hero. And it's true. So I'm really happy to introduce you to even more people.
So if anybody out there is in the middle of this, keep going. Just know that it's temporary and you'll get through it. Just keep going. Get the support that you need if you need it, but keep going.
Thank you for listening to the Mad in America podcast. For more news, views, and updates, visit madinamerica.com.